You've been lied to about medieval peasants, not in a small academic way, but in a way so fundamental that it quietly shapes how you judge work, productivity, and even yourself. The image is familiar. Bent backs in muddy fields, endless toil from dawn to dusk, short, brutal lives defined by exhaustion. Medieval farmers, we're told, worked constantly, and modern people are simply softer. But here's the uncomfortable truth. A typical medieval peasant did not work 300 days a year. In many regions, they didn't even work 200. In fact, historical records suggest medieval agricultural workers enjoyed up to 150 days off per year, sometimes more. At this point, most modern listeners feel a flicker of irritation. That can't be right. This must be romantic revisionism. After all, medieval life was nasty, brutish, and short, wasn't it? That irritation is the hook, because it tells us we're about to break a belief we've never properly examined. The real question isn't whether medieval peasants worked hard. They did. Harvest weeks were brutal. Haymaking destroyed bodies. Plowing heavy soil without machines demanded strength modern gym-goers rarely approach. The real question is this: why did people who lived with less technology, less medicine, and less comfort structure their lives around more rest than we do today? And more disturbingly, why have we been taught to see that rest as laziness rather than wisdom? This story follows a method you've already seen before. Break a modern assumption, compare it with the past, ask what changed, then investigate the system that benefited from that change. The structure mirrors historical investigations used to expose myths about food, health, and progress. So let's begin where the myth begins. The medieval work year was not a blur of endless labor. It was seasonal, rhythmic, and fragmented by design. Agricultural work followed daylight and weather, not clocks. Winter was slow. Fields rested. Tools were repaired. People slept more. Spring planting required bursts of effort, followed by long waiting periods. Summer brought haymaking, then pauses. Autumn harvest was intense but brief, and threaded through this natural rhythm was something modern life has almost entirely erased: institutionalized rest. The medieval calendar was crowded with feast days, not symbolic ones, real days off, saints' days, church festivals, local holy days, regional celebrations. In many Catholic regions, these amounted to 80 to 100 non-working days annually. Add Sundays, universally enforced as rest days, and you're already well past what modern labor law would tolerate. And that's before accounting for seasonal downtime. This wasn't accidental inefficiency. It was an accepted model of life. Even lords and landowners, often caricatured as exploitative, did not expect continuous year-round labor. Feudal obligations were specific and limited: a certain number of days plowing the lord's field, a certain number harvesting. Outside those windows, peasants worked their own land or rested. This is where modern listeners usually object. But they were poor. Surely they had to work constantly just to survive. That objection reveals our bias. We assume survival requires maximum output because our system demands it. But medieval subsistence economies optimized for sufficiency, not growth. Once grain stores were filled and rents paid, working more did not meaningfully improve life. There was no consumer market waiting to absorb surplus effort, no endless ladder of upgrades. More work didn't equal more happiness. So people stopped. And this is the part that unsettles modern sensibilities the most. Rest was not a reward. It was the default. Work happened when necessary, not the other way around. Now pause for a moment and reflect, because this is the early CTA moment that matters. Think about your own life. How many days off do you truly get each year? Not theoretical vacation days. Actual days where no email arrives, no task lingers, no guilt hums in the background. Does rest feel natural, or does it feel earned? If rest feels like something you must justify, you're already living inside a very different moral framework than a medieval farmer ever did. So where did the myth of the lazy peasant come from? Ironically, it didn't originate in the Middle Ages. It emerged after them. Early modern elites, especially during the rise of wage labor, began reframing leisure as vice. Protestant reformers criticized feast days as immoral excess. Factory owners needed consistent labor, not seasonal bursts. Time discipline replaced task completion. In this new worldview, anyone who wasn't working when they could be working was morally suspect. Medieval peasants, retroactively judged by industrial standards, suddenly looked idle, and that judgment stuck. History books written in industrial societies projected their values backward, recasting pre-industrial rhythms as inefficiency instead of adaptation. What had once been balance became backwardness. What had been communal rest became sloth. But historical evidence refuses to cooperate with that story. Manorial records show limited required labor days. Church documents list feast calendars so full they shocked later reformers. Legal disputes arose when lords tried to increase labor demands because such increases were seen as violations of custom. Custom, in medieval life, was law. Which leads us to the deeper investigation. What kind of human being was medieval society trying to produce? Not a maximally productive worker, not an endlessly optimizing individual, but a member of a community who worked when necessary, rested when possible, worshipped regularly, and accepted limits on growth, on ambition, on output. That worldview didn't disappear because it was disproven. It disappeared because it was inconvenient. By the end of this story, the question won't be whether medieval peasants were lazy. The question will be whether we've redefined exhaustion as virtue, and then forgotten that it was a choice. In the next part, we'll examine the hard evidence, calendars, labor records, and first-hand accounts that quantify medieval rest, and we'll confront why modern society reacts so defensively when those numbers are mentioned. Because when you realize how much rest humans once considered normal, it becomes impossible not to ask, who benefits from us forgetting it? If the idea of medieval peasants resting 120 to 150 days a year still feels exaggerated, that reaction is worth examining, because it's exactly where modern intuition collides with historical evidence. Let's stop speculating and look at the records. Manorial accounts from England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire consistently list labor services by day, not by year. A peasant might owe his lord 2 to 3 days of work per week during specific seasons. Outside those windows, obligations dropped sharply, or vanished altogether. There was no expectation of continuous labor simply because daylight existed. In England, for example, customary labor services often amounted to around 150 days per year, and that's counting all required agricultural work, not just work for the Lord. The rest of the year was fragmented by Sundays, feast days, bad weather, and seasonal inactivity. Church calendars reinforce this pattern. Medieval Europe was saturated with holy days, major feasts, minor feasts, local saints, regional observances. Many trades were legally forbidden to operate on these days. Violating feast day rest could result in fines, not praise. Rest wasn't optional. It was enforced. This is where modern logic breaks down. Today, rest is framed as recovery from work. In medieval society, work was framed as an interruption of rest. That inversion is difficult for us to grasp because our moral economy is built on a different premise. Time must be monetized. Medieval time wasn't. There were no hourly wages for most peasants, no productivity metrics, no abstract career trajectory. Labor was task-based. When the task was done, work stopped. Continuing to labor without necessity wasn't admirable, it was pointless. And that brings us to the accusation most often raised at this point. But medieval life was incredibly hard. Infant mortality was high, famine happened. Surely that means people had to work constantly. This is a false equivalence. Hardship does not automatically imply continuous labor. In fact, many hardships of medieval life were not solvable by working more hours. A failed harvest couldn't be fixed by individual overwork. Disease didn't respond to effort. Weather ignored ambition. Recognizing these limits shaped behavior. When outcomes weren't controllable through effort, relentless labor lost its moral justification. This worldview produced a different relationship with exhaustion. Being tired after harvest was normal. Being tired all the time was not. At this point in the investigation, a deeper question emerges, one that mirrors the analytical pivot used in other historical myth-busting narratives. If medieval peasants weren't lazy and weren't endlessly overworked, why does modern society need them to have been both? The answer lies in comparison. The Industrial Revolution didn't just introduce machines. It introduced a new moral story. Factories required synchronized labor. Machines could not wait for seasons or saints' days. Owners needed predictable output. To achieve this, they had to break older rhythms and justify doing so. Rest was rebranded as waste. Feast days became superstition. Seasonal downtime became inefficiency. The medieval past was reframed as something to escape, not understand. This reframing wasn't neutral history. It was ideological. By portraying pre-industrial people as poor because they rested, industrial society could argue that modern exhaustion was the price of progress. Long hours became a badge of civilization, and once that idea took hold, it turned inward. Workers who resisted longer hours weren't defending balance. They were accused of backwardness, laziness, moral failure. Sound familiar? Now consider this uncomfortable comparison. A medieval peasant experienced intense physical labor, but not constant psychological pressure. There were no deadlines that followed him home, no abstract future goals demanding present sacrifice. His identity wasn't fused to productivity. Modern workers experience the opposite. Many perform less physically demanding tasks, but under permanent cognitive load. Work bleeds into rest. Rest triggers guilt. Even leisure becomes optimized. From that perspective, calling medieval peasants lazy says more about us than about them. It reveals a culture that cannot tolerate the idea that humans once accepted limits and lived within them. This brings us to the hidden assumption behind the entire myth, that progress means more output, more hours, more growth. But medieval society operated on a different axiom. Enough is enough. Once that threshold was met, additional labor didn't elevate status, guarantee security, or improve meaning. So it wasn't pursued. This isn't nostalgia, it's structural analysis. And it forces a dangerous realization. If people once lived with significantly more rest, not because they were ignorant, but because their system allowed it, then modern exhaustion is not inevitable. It's engineered. In the final part, we'll confront the most difficult layer of this story. Not whether medieval peasants were lazy, not whether they worked hard, but why modern society reacts so emotionally to the idea that they rested more than we do, and what that reaction reveals about how we've been trained to see work, worth, and time itself. Because once you understand what was lost, the question stops being historical. It becomes personal. There is a reason the idea of medieval peasants resting half the year doesn't just surprise modern audiences, it angers them. That anger isn't about history. It's about legitimacy. Because if people once lived with more rest, more communal time, and fewer working hours, not due to ignorance, but because their system allowed it, then our exhaustion loses its moral grounding, and that is intolerable to a society built on the belief that suffering proves worth. This is the final layer of the investigation, and it's the most uncomfortable one. Modern culture doesn't merely encourage hard work. It moralizes exhaustion. Being busy signals virtue. Being tired implies importance. Saying, "I'm swamped," functions as a status marker. Meanwhile, rest, real rest, triggers anxiety. Idleness feels suspicious. Guilt creeps in the moment productivity pauses. That psychological reflex didn't evolve naturally. It was trained. As industrial capitalism expanded, it required not just labor, but self-disciplining labor. Workers had to internalize the idea that time belonged to employers, markets, and abstract goals. External enforcement alone wasn't enough. The system needed people to police themselves. So work became identity. And once work becomes identity, rest becomes a threat. This is why medieval peasants must be remembered as miserable, ignorant, and lazy. Not because the evidence supports it, but because the alternative undermines everything modern society demands of its members. The story must be that they suffered endlessly. Otherwise, why are we still doing this? Notice how selective modern nostalgia is. We romanticize medieval craftsmanship, slow food, handmade tools, and simpler times, but recoil when confronted with medieval attitudes toward time. We want artisanal bread, not artisanal calendars. We praise tradition, but only when it doesn't challenge productivity. The moment history suggests humans once accepted limits on labor, ambition, and growth, it stops being interesting and becomes dangerous. That pattern mirrors other investigations into lost knowledge, food systems, health practices, communal living. In each case, the past isn't rejected because it was wrong, but because it contradicts profitable narratives of progress. And rest is the most dangerous contradiction of all. Let's be clear about something. Medieval peasants did not live in paradise. Their lives were fragile. Violence existed. Disease was real. Inequality was brutal. No one is arguing for a return to feudalism. But acknowledging those truths does not require us to pretend they worked non-stop. In fact, it's precisely because life was uncertain that rest mattered. Rest wasn't indulgence. It was resilience. Extended periods of downtime allowed bodies to recover, communities to bond, traditions to transmit, meaning to exist outside output. Festivals weren't distractions from life. They were life. Modern societies flipped that equation. Life is now something you squeeze into the margins of work. This reframing explains why discussions about shorter work weeks, universal basic income, or expanded holidays trigger moral panic. The resistance isn't economic, it's existential. If people work less, who are they? If worth isn't tied to output, what replaces it? Medieval society had answers to those questions. They weren't perfect answers, but they existed. Identity came from role, faith, family, and community. Time wasn't something to conquer. It was something to inhabit. We abandoned that framework without replacing it. So we filled the void with busyness. And this brings us back to the original provocation. Were medieval peasants lazy? Only if rest is laziness. Only if limits are failure. Only if humanity's value is measured exclusively by production. By medieval standards, we are the strange ones, working beyond necessity, accumulating beyond use, exhausted beyond reason. They would not have admired our hustle. They would have pitied it. The purpose of this story was never to idealize the past. It was to expose a choice made gradually, quietly, and then enforced so thoroughly that it no longer feels like one. Once upon a time, humans structured life around seasons, bodies, and community. Work served life. Rest protected it. Somewhere along the way, we inverted that relationship and rewrote history to justify it. Remembering that medieval peasants rested 150 days a year doesn't mean we should copy them. It means we should ask why the idea unsettles us so deeply. Because whatever makes rest feel like rebellion is the same force that benefits from our forgetting it ever existed.